Iran war. Situation are zyada dangerous. What if I told you this war isn't escalating by accident? That every strike, every delay, every statement is part of a larger timed strategy? Because when you step back and look at the sequence of events, not just what is happening, but when it's happening, it starts to feel less like chaos and more like coordination. And once you see that pattern, it becomes very hard to ignore. Let me walk you through this. We are now in early April 2026, and the Iran war situation is entering a phase that is far more dangerous than most people realize. And the reason it feels confusing is because what we are seeing on the surface is only a small part of a much bigger strategic design that is unfolding in layers. Over the past few weeks, we've seen a steady increase in US-backed operations in the region, particularly targeting Iranian-linked assets across Iraq, Syria, and strategic maritime routes. And at the same time, Iran has been responding in a way that looks reactive, but actually shows signs of calculated restraint mixed with controlled escalation. But here's where it gets interesting. These actions didn't begin randomly. They align almost perfectly with a series of political and economic triggers that were already in motion long before the first headlines started appearing. Go back to mid-March 2026. Around March 15th, tensions began to rise after intelligence reports suggested that Iran had accelerated its regional proxy coordination, particularly through groups operating near the Strait of Hormuz. And this wasn't just about positioning troops or weapons. It was about signaling capability to disrupt one of the most critical energy arteries in the world. By March 20th, U.S. naval presence in the Gulf had quietly increased by nearly 18%, according to defense tracking estimates, including additional destroyers, surveillance aircraft, and support vessels that don't get much attention in mainstream coverage, but play a crucial role in sustained operations. That's not a reaction, that's preparation. Then, on March 25th, financial markets started to respond, but not in a sudden panic, rather in a slow and calculated shift that suggested large institutional players were already adjusting their expectations. Oil prices, which had been relatively stable around $88 per barrel in early March, suddenly began climbing, and by March 28th, they crossed $95. And now, as of April 2nd, oil has surged past $106 per barrel, and some intraday trades have even tested slightly higher levels depending on regional supply concerns. Think about that. A nearly 20% increase in just over 2 weeks. That kind of movement doesn't just reflect fear. It reflects expectation, positioning, and in some cases, even anticipation of prolonged instability. But it gets worse, because while the public narrative focuses on military escalation, the deeper story is about leverage, control, and timing. Iran controls one of the most critical choke points in global energy supply, the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes every single day. And even a minor disruption or credible threat to that route immediately shifts global pricing power and forces major economies to react. Now let's connect the dots. Rising oil prices don't just hurt consumers, they benefit producers in a very direct and measurable way. Countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and even U.S. shale producers see immediate financial upside. In fact, every $10 increase in oil prices adds billions in revenue to major exporting nations, strengthening their fiscal positions and giving them more room to maneuver politically and strategically. So when tensions rise and prices spike, certain players gain massive economic leverage almost overnight. And that leverage can then be used in negotiations, alliances, and long-term planning. Here's where the timing becomes even more strategic. The U.S. is heading into a critical political window, with policy decisions, budget debates, and electoral pressures building toward late 2026. And in such an environment, maintaining influence over global energy markets becomes essential not just for economic stability, but for political credibility as well. A controlled level of instability can actually serve as a tool, keeping prices elevated but not uncontrollable, applying pressure without triggering total collapse, and maintaining a narrative of active leadership on the global stage. And Iran understands this just as well. By increasing regional pressure without crossing a full-scale war threshold, Tehran creates a constant state of uncertainty, and that uncertainty becomes its bargaining chip, its strategic asset, its way of staying relevant and influential without risking complete confrontation. It signals capability without committing to irreversible escalation. But look at the sequence again. Military positioning in mid-March, market reaction by late March, political messaging by early April. This is not random. This is layered, coordinated, and deeply interconnected. Now think about the financial markets. Global stock indices have shown increased volatility, particularly in sectors tied to energy, defense, and logistics. And this volatility is not evenly distributed. It is concentrated in areas that are directly influenced by geopolitical risk. Defense contractors in the U.S. have already seen share increases between 6 to 12% over the past 2 weeks, reflecting expectations of increased government spending and long-term contracts. Shipping insurance rates in the Gulf have nearly doubled, increasing operational costs for global trade and adding another layer of economic pressure that eventually reaches consumers worldwide. These are not small signals. These are structural shifts that indicate a system adjusting to a new level of risk. And here's the part most people are missing. This conflict is not just about the Middle East. It's about global alignment and strategic positioning across multiple regions at the same time. China has been quietly increasing its oil reserves, taking advantage of fluctuating supply conditions and building a buffer against future disruptions. India is negotiating discounted energy imports, trying to secure favorable terms in a volatile market. Europe, still recovering from previous energy disruptions, is trying to secure alternative supply chains and reduce dependency on unstable regions. Every move in this conflict is triggering reactions across the entire global system, creating a chain reaction that extends far beyond the immediate battlefield. Now, let's talk about military dynamics in more detail. The U.S. has deployed additional carrier strike groups within operational range of key Iranian positions, along with enhanced missile defense systems and intelligence assets. Satellite data suggests increased surveillance activity, particularly focused on missile infrastructure, drone launch sites, and naval assets that could be used to disrupt shipping lanes. Iran, on the other hand, has increased readiness levels among its Revolutionary Guard units, expanded drone operations in strategic zones, and strengthened coordination with allied groups in neighboring regions. But notice something important. Despite all this activity, neither side has crossed the line into full-scale direct confrontation. That restraint is not weakness. It's calculation, discipline, and strategic patience. Because once that line is crossed, control is lost. Escalation becomes unpredictable, and the costs increase exponentially for all parties involved. And right now, control is everything. Here's where it gets even more interesting. There's an emerging timeline that points toward a critical window between late May and early July 2026. And this window is not arbitrary. It aligns with multiple overlapping factors that increase both risk and opportunity. Seasonal energy demand begins to rise as global consumption patterns shift, increasing pressure on supply chains. Key diplomatic summits are scheduled, where global leaders will have the opportunity to negotiate, align, or confront each other on these issues. Internal political milestones in several major countries create additional incentives for strong positioning and decisive action. If escalation continues at its current pace, that window could become a turning point where decisions made behind closed doors reshape the direction of the conflict. So the question becomes, who benefits from prolonging this tension until that moment? Energy exporters benefit from sustained high prices and increased revenues. Defense industries benefit from continued contracts, increased production, and long-term demand. Political leaders benefit from controlling narratives of strength, security, and decisive action. Even financial institutions benefit from volatility that creates trading opportunities and profit margins. But there's another layer that is even more significant in the long term: currency dynamics. As oil prices rise, the US dollar often strengthens due to its central role in global oil trade, reinforcing its position as the dominant reserve currency. However, prolonged instability can also push countries to explore alternative payment systems, reducing dependency on the dollar and creating new financial alliances. China and Russia have already been experimenting with non-dollar energy transactions, bilateral trade agreements, and digital currency frameworks that bypass traditional systems. So this conflict could accelerate a much larger shift in global financial architecture, one that has been developing slowly but could gain momentum under the pressure of sustained geopolitical tension. Think about that for a second. A regional conflict influencing the future of global currency systems and potentially reshaping the balance of economic power. Now let's bring this back to strategy. Iran's goal is not to win a conventional war against a superior military force. Its goal is to increase its negotiating position, to gain leverage, to force engagement on its own terms. By demonstrating its ability to disrupt global systems, even temporarily, it sends a message that it cannot be ignored or sidelined. The US, meanwhile, is trying to maintain dominance without overcommitting resources, especially given other global priorities and strategic challenges in different regions. And that creates a delicate balance that requires constant adjustment. Push too hard, and you trigger full escalation with unpredictable consequences. Hold back too much, and you lose leverage, credibility, and influence. This is why every statement, every strike, every movement is measured and calculated. Even the language used by officials is carefully calibrated. Words like limited response, targeted action, and defensive measures are not just descriptions. They are signals sent to allies, adversaries, and markets at the same time. Now, here's the part where you need to pay close attention, because this is where the future starts to take shape. If this trajectory continues, we could see several major developments within the next 3 to 6 months, each with its own set of consequences and ripple effects. Oil prices could continue to rise, potentially reaching $115 to $125 per barrel if supply disruptions intensify or if perceived risk increases further. Expanded military presence from additional global actors could introduce new variables and increase the complexity of the situation, possibly including NATO-aligned support operations or regional coalitions. A high-stakes diplomatic push, likely conducted behind closed doors, could aim at redefining regional power arrangements, security guarantees, and economic cooperation frameworks. And right in the middle of all this, public perception becomes a battlefield of its own. Media narratives, political messaging, and information flow will shape how these events are understood, interpreted, and responded to by populations around the world. Because controlling the story is almost as important as controlling the outcome, especially in an era where information spreads instantly and influences decision-making at every level. If you're following this closely, this is exactly the kind of analysis we break down regularly on ANC News, where we go beyond the headlines and connect the deeper strategic dots that most people miss. Now let's raise the biggest question of all, the question that will define the next phase of this conflict. Is this situation being carefully managed by experienced actors who understand the risks and know how to control escalation? Or is it slowly slipping beyond control as competing interests, miscalculations, and unexpected developments begin to collide? Because history shows us that prolonged strategic tension has a way of reaching tipping points, moments where control is lost, and events begin to unfold in ways that no one fully anticipated. One miscalculation, one unexpected move, one escalation that goes further than intended, and suddenly the entire structure changes. Alliances shift, markets react violently, and the cost of reversing course becomes much higher. We've seen this pattern before in different forms, in different regions, at different times. Controlled conflicts turning into uncontrollable crises, economic pressure turning into systemic shock, political strategy turning into unintended consequence. And yet, despite all the risks, the current behavior of global actors suggests that they believe they can manage this, that they can keep it within limits, that they can extract advantage without triggering disaster. But can they? Because the closer we move toward that mid-2026 window, the higher the stakes become, and the narrower the margin for error gets. Energy markets tighten, political pressures increase, military positioning intensifies. Diplomatic channels become more active, but also more strained, and every decision carries more weight than the last. This is not just about Iran. This is about how power is exercised in a multipolar world where multiple actors have the ability to influence outcomes in different ways. It's about how economic tools, military presence, and political timing intersect to shape global outcomes in ways that are often invisible until it's too late. And right now, all those forces are converging in a way that demands attention, analysis, and careful observation. So as you watch the headlines and follow the developments, remember this. What looks like escalation might actually be positioning. What looks like reaction might actually be strategy. And what looks like a crisis might actually be a negotiation in disguise. A complex and high-stakes negotiation that is playing out across multiple domains at the same time. But negotiations like this don't stay quiet forever. At some point, they reach a moment where decisions have to be made, lines have to be drawn, and consequences become unavoidable. That moment may be closer than it appears, and when it arrives, the impact will be felt far beyond the immediate region. If you want to stay ahead of these developments and truly understand what's driving them beneath the surface, keep following ANC News, because this is a story that is evolving in real time and requires constant attention to detail and context. And as of now, one thing is clear. This is not the peak of the crisis. This is the buildup, the phase where positions are set, strategies are tested, and outcomes are still uncertain. The geopolitical chessboard is shifting, alliances are being tested, and every move from here carries greater risk than the last. This is just the beginning, and the global power game behind this conflict is far from over. ANC News will continue tracking every development as this high-stakes situation unfolds.